Hi everyone, today we're reviewing Chapter 11, Drifting Towards Disunion. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was determined to awaken the North to the wickedness of slavery. She wanted to lay bare its terrible inhumanity, especially the splitting of families. She relied on powerful imagery and touching pathos. Deeper sources of her anti-slavery sentiments lay in the evangelical crusades of the Second Great Awakening. This is a portrait of Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is the advertisement for the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Lincoln remarked that this is the book that started the war. This is an excerpt from Uncle Tom's Cabin. The success of the novel at home and abroad was sensational. There were also lengthy runs on stage in Tom shows. No other novel in American history can be compared to it as a political force. When introduced to President Lincoln in 1862, he remarked, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Stowe never witnessed slavery in the Deep South. She had seen it briefly during a visit to Kentucky, but she lived in Ohio, which was the center of the Underground Railroad activity. Uncle Tom, the character in the book, left an endearing and enduring impression on the North, and many swore they would have nothing to do with enforcing the fugitive slave law. It was devoured by millions of impressionable youth, immensely popular abroad, especially in Britain and France as well. Also, Hinton Helper wrote The Impending Crisis of the South in 1857. Hating slavery and blacks, he attempted to prove with statistics that indirectly non-slaveholding whites were the ones who suffered most from the millstone of slavery, and he finally found a publisher in the North that would publish it. This helped fuel fears of planters that non-slaveholding majorities might abandon them. The book became banned in the South. In the North, thousands distributed it as a campaign literature by Republicans. Southerners were embittered when they learned that the Northern brethren were spreading their wicked lies. Popular sovereignty is now an idea that comes onto the scene. The New England Immigrant Aid Company was an anti-slavery organization that sent 2,000 people to Kansas to forestall the South and to make profit. Many carried the new breech-loading Sharps rifles named Beecher's Bibles, after Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, who helped raise money to pay for them. The Southern spokesman raised cries of betrayal. Northern Nebraskals were out to abolitionize both Kansas and Nebraska. Some Southern hotheads attempted to assist small groups of well-armed slave owners to Kansas. Planting slavery in Kansas was a losing game. The slaves were valuable and volatile property. It was foolish for owners to take them where bullets were flying, and Kansas might be voted free under popular sovereignty. The census of 1860 found only 2 slaves among 107,000 in Kansas and only 15 in Nebraska. Crisis conditions in Kansas rapidly worsened. In the 1855 election for the first territorial legislature, the pro-slavery border ruffians poured in from Missouri to vote early and often. Slavery supporters triumphed and set up a puppet government at the Shawnee Mission. Free Soilers established extra-legal regime of their own in Topeka. This is a map of Bleeding Kansas from 1854 to 1860. This area was attempted to be colonized or populated by both pro-slavery and anti-slaverites in an attempt to win the popular sovereignty battle. The confused Kansans had a choice of 2 governments. One was based on fraud and the other was based on illegality. Tensions mounted as settlers feuded over conflicting land claims. The breaking point was in 1856 when a gang of pro-slavery raiders, alleging provocation, shot up and burned part of the free soil town of Lawrence. It was called the Sacking of Lawrence. Outrage was a prelude to a bloodier tragedy. John Brown now stalked upon the Kansas battlefield. He was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause. He was brooding over the attack in Lawrence, and he led a band to Pottawatomie Creek in May of 1856. There they hacked to pieces 5 surprised men who were presumed to be pro-slaveryites. The terrorist butchery besmirched the Free Soil cause and brought vicious retaliation from pro-slavery forces. This is a daguerreotype of John Brown. Civil war erupted in Kansas as a result in 1856. It continued until it merged with the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. They destroyed millions of dollars worth of property. It paralyzed the agriculture in the areas and cost scores of lives. Kansas applied for statehood on popular sovereignty basis. The Lecompton Constitution was the pro-slavery constitution. People were not allowed to vote for or against the Constitution as a whole. A vote for the Constitution either with slavery or with no slavery, but basically it provided for protections for slavery that was already there. Whatever the outcome, there would still be slavery. Free Soilers boycotted the polls, and pro-slaverites approved the Constitution with slavery in late 1857. The scene then shifted to Washington, where President Pierce had been succeeded by James Buchanan, who was strongly under Southern influence. Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution. Senator Douglas threw his support behind the true popular sovereignty. The compromise would have been to submit the entire Lecompton Constitution to the people. Free Soiler voters thronged to the polls and voted it down. Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when Southern secessionists left Congress. Buchanan's action divided the Democratic Party by antagonizing the Democrats in the North. This became Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas spattered blood on the Senate floor in 1856, where Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts was a leading abolitionist. He made himself one of the most disliked men in the Senate and delivered a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. He condemned pro-slavery men and referred insultingly to a South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler. The Congressman Preston Brooks from South Carolina resented the insults to his state and to its senator, and to Brooks the only alternative was to chastise the senator who spoke these remarks. So on May 22, 1856, he approached Sumner and pounded him with an 11-ounce cane until it broke. This is Preston Brooks caning Charles Sumner in 1856, and we'll discuss this political cartoon in our classroom lessons. The House could not muster enough votes to expel Brooks. He resigned, but was triumphantly reelected. Sumner had to go to Europe for treatment for his injuries, and for 3.5 years, Massachusetts kept his seat open until Sumner could return. Bleeding Sumner thus joined with Bleeding Kansas, both as political issues. The Free Soil North was infuriated by Brooks. Copies of Sumner's speech sold by the thousands. Every blow to Sumner made thousands of Republicans. The South was not unanimous in approving Brooks, but they were angered by the Sumner speech and upset that the speech was so applauded in the North. The Sumner-Brooks clash and ensuing reactions revealed how dangerously inflamed the passions had become. Blows rained on Sumner were the first blows of the Civil War. The Democrats met in Cincinnati to elect the presidential standard-bearer for 1856, and they chose James Buchanan. He was serving in London during Kansas-Nebraska uproar, so he was Kansas-less. In a crisis that called for giants, he was very mediocre, irresolute, and confused. The Republicans met in Philadelphia, and Higher Law Stewart was a conspicuous leader. However, the final choice was John C. Fremont, who was called the Pathfinder of the West, and virtually without any political experience, but he was not tarred by the incidents in Kansas either. Republicans came out strongly against the extension of slavery into the territories, and Democrats declared emphatically for popular sovereignty. Ugly anti-foreignism was injected into the campaign as well. There was an influx of Irish and German immigrants that alarmed the nativists, and basically the Know Nothing Party organized as a result. And it was called the Know Nothing Party because of its secretness. It was anti-foreign and anti-Catholic, and in 1856 it nominated ex-President Millard Fillmore. They threatened to cut into the Republican strength, and the mudslinging began for both candidates. This was the Know Nothing banner of the Know Nothing Party in 1856. The election returns came in. Buchanan polled less than a majority of the popular vote, but he won. The Electoral College count was 174 to 114, and the popular votes can be seen here for Buchanan, for Fremont, and for Fillmore. This is a electoral map of the presidential election of 1856, and we'll discuss this in our lessons. Why were they defeated? Fremont's lack of honesty, capacity, and sound judgment played a role. Southern threat that election of black Republicans, or of the black Republican, as he was considered, would be a declaration of war, forcing the South to succeed. Many Southerners thus were intimidated by the vote for Buchanan, and there was an innate conservatism that triumphed that was assisted by Southern bullyism. It was fortunate for the Union that secession and Civil War did not come in 1856. Fremont was ill-balanced and a second-rate figure, and in 1856 the North was more willing to let the South depart in peace rather than 1860. Dramatic events that take place from 1856 to 1860 will still arouse the apathetic Northerners to a fighting pitch. And in 1856, the election cast a long shadow as politicians both in the North and South peered anxiously towards 1860. Dred Scott versus Sanford was a decision by the Supreme Court on March 6, 1857. The decision was one of the opening paper gun blasts of the Civil War. The case was simple. A slave had lived for 5 years on free soil. The Supreme Court turned it into a very complex political issue and ruled that Scott was a black slave and not a citizen, and that hence he did not even have the right to be able to sue in federal courts. The court could have thrown out the case on these technical grounds, but they chose not to do that. Instead, the majority decided to go further, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was from the slave state of Maryland. And they decreed that because a slave was private property, he or she could be taken into any territory and legally held there in slavery. The reasons were that the Fifth Amendment forbade Congress to deprive people of property without the due process of law, and slaves were then considered property. The court went even further and ruled the Compromise of 1820 unconstitutional. Congress had no power to ban slavery from the territories, regardless of what the territorial legislatures themselves might want. Southerners were delighted with this victory, and champions of popular sovereignty were shocked. Another lethal wedge was driven between the North and Southern wings of the once united Democratic Party. This is a picture of Dred Scott and his daughters, and we'll read about this in our activities in class. The foes of slavery extension were infuriated by the Dred Scott decision. They insisted the ruling was an opinion, not a binding decision. Republicans defied the court because most members of the court were Southern, and by entering politics, the court had debased itself. Southerners were inflamed by this defiance. How long could they be joined to a section that refused to honor the Supreme Court? The Panic of 1857 and the financial crash that happened as a result leads to the tensions in this time period. The inpouring of California gold had inflated the currency, the demands of the Crimean War with Russia had overstimulated grain production, and a frenzied speculation in land and railroads also led to the crash. Over 5,000 businesses failed. The North and South and its grain growers were hardest hit, and the South was still enjoying favorable cotton prices abroad. This is a picture of the panic on Wall Street in 1857. Panic provided further proof that cotton was king and helped drive the overconfident Southerners closer to a shooting showdown. Distress in the North, especially agricultural, invigorated the call for homesteads of 160 acres from the public domain. The opposition to this free farmland was Eastern industrialists who feared losing workers, and the South opposed because plantation slavery was not possible on only 160 acres. Congress in 1860 passed the Homestead Act, which made public land available for 25 cents an acre, but was killed by President Buchanan's veto. The Panic of 1857 created a clamor for higher tariff rates, and because of the large Treasury surplus as well as pressure from the South, Congress lowers tariffs in 1857. The tariff of 1857 reduced duties to about 20% on dutiable goods, which was its lowest point since 1812. As the Treasury surplus melted away, industrials in the North pointed to a need for higher duties, mostly concerned about the need for increased population. The Panic of 1857 gave Republicans two surefire economic issues for the 1860 election: protection for the unprotected and farms for the farmless. The Illinois senatorial election of 1858 claimed the national spotlight, as Senator Stephen Douglas was up for re-election, and the Republicans ran a Springfield lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. He was not well educated, but an avid reader, married above himself into the influential Todd family of Kentucky. He emerged as a trial lawyer in Illinois, widely referred to as Honest Abe, and served an undistinguished term in Congress from 1847 to 1849. The Kansas-Nebraska Act lit a fire within him, and he emerged as one of the foremost Republican politicians and orators in the Northwest. At the Republican convention in 1856, Lincoln received 100 votes for the vice presidential nomination. This is a picture of Abraham Lincoln at age 37. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were one of the great debates in U.S. history. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates, and Douglas accepted, and they took place from August to October of 1858. The most famous debate was in Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln presented a question based on the Supreme Court ruling in the Dred Scott decision. Douglas had already publicly answered the Freeport question, but the little giant did not hesitate to meet the issue head-on, honestly and consistently. Now, the Freeport Doctrine said no matter how the Supreme Court ruled, slavery would stay down if people voted it down, and that was the belief of Stephen Douglas. The laws were to protect slavery and would have to be passed by territorial legislatures. In the absence of popular approval, slavery would soon disappear, and that's how Stephen Douglas felt. Where public opinion does not support federal government, as was the case in Jefferson's embargo, the law becomes impossible to enforce. Douglas defeated Lincoln for the Senate seat. His loyalty to popular sovereignty was decisive, and the senators were then chosen by state legislatures. Honest Abe emerged as a potential Republican nominee for president. Douglas, in winning Illinois, actually lost chances for winning the presidency, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates proved to be one of the preliminary battles of the Civil War. This is a picture of the Lincoln-Douglas debate in 1858. John Brown now enters the scene. And John Brown had studied tactics of black rebels, Toussaint Louverture from Haiti, and Nat Turner. He hatched a scheme to invade the South secretly, then to call upon the slaves to rebel and furnish them with arms, then establish a free black state as a sanctuary. So at Harper's Ferry, Brown seized the federal arsenal in October 1859 and killed 7 innocent people, injured 10 or so more, but the slaves failed to rise up. Brown and his remnants were captured by U.S. Marines under the command of Robert E. Lee. They were convicted of murder and treason, marched up scaffold steps without flinching, and he was devoted to freedom, so inflexible that he took on this exalted character and ended up becoming a martyr for the abolitionist cause. The effects of Harper's Ferry were inflammatory. To the South, Brown was a murderer and an apostle of treason. They assumed the entire North was Brown-loving Republicans. Moderate Northerners and Republican leaders deplored Brown's actions, but abolitionists and ardent Free Soilers were infuriated by Brown's execution. And Free Soiler centers in the North tolled bells, fired guns, and lowered flags and held rallies as a result, so the ghost of the martyred Brown would not be laid to rest. This is a painting titled The Last Moments of John Brown by Thomas Hovden. This painting has become famous as kind of an allegorical expression of the pathos of Brown's martyrdom for the abolitionist cause. Now, the presidential election of 1860 was the most fateful in American history. The Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina. Douglas was the leading candidate of the Northern Whig Party. The Southern Whigs regarded him as a traitor because of the Lecompton Constitution and the Freeport Doctrine. The Cotton State delegates walked out, and the remaining delegates disbanded after being unable to generate enough votes to nominate Douglas. The first tragic secession was the secession of Southerners from the Democratic National Convention. This departure became habit-forming. Democrats tried again in Baltimore. Douglas Democrats were firmly in control, but after the Cotton State delegates again withdrew, the rest of the delegates unenthusiastically nominated Douglas. The platform came out squarely for popular sovereignty and against obstruction of the fugitive slave law by the states. Southern Democrats then selected John Breckinridge as their candidate. The platform favored the extension of slavery into the territories and annexation of slave-populated Cuba. The Constitutional Union Party was a middle-of-the-road party, sneered as a do-nothing or old gentleman's party, and they wanted a compromise candidate and met in Baltimore and nominated John Bell of Tennessee for the presidency. The Republicans met in Chicago. William Seward was the first known candidate. He was an irrepressible conflict because of a speech he had given in Rochester in 1858, which ruined his prospects, and his enemy's slogan was success rather than Steward. Lincoln of Illinois basically was second best, but a strong candidate because he had fewer enemies, and he overtook Seward on the third ballot to gain the nomination. The platform made the appeal to every non-Southern group. For Free Soilers, non-extension of slavery. For Northern manufacturers, a protective tariff. And for immigrants, no abridgment of rights. For the Northwest, a Pacific Railroad. For the West, internal improvements at federal expense. And for farmers, free homesteads from public domain. Southern secessionists called Lincoln an abolitionist rail splitter who would split the Union. Lincoln hated slavery, but he was not an outright abolitionist. Lincoln enthusiasts staged roaring rallies and parades. Douglas waged a vigorous speaking campaign against him, and the returns proclaimed a sweeping victory for Lincoln. Lincoln hits a home run. This is a print from Currier and Ives, which portrays Lincoln's victory over John Bell and Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge as a baseball game. This is a table that shows the results for the popular vote and the electoral vote for the election of 1860. Lincoln was a minority president. 60% of the voters preferred someone else. Lincoln was also a sectional president. In 10 southern states, he was not even on the ballot. And the election of 1860 was virtually two elections, one for the North and one for the South. South Carolina rejoiced over Lincoln's victory. Now they had an excuse to secede. Douglas won only 12 electoral votes. Even though he campaigned energetically, Douglas and Breckinridge together had amassed more votes than Lincoln. This is the presidential election of 1860 by electoral vote by state and popular vote by county. The ballot box did not indicate strong sentiment for secession. Breckinridge polled fewer votes in slave states than the combined strength of Douglas and Bell, but Breckinridge failed to carry his own state of Kentucky. Even though the Republicans had elected Lincoln, they controlled neither the Senate nor the House. The South had a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court, and the U.S. government could not touch slavery in slave states except by constitutional amendment, which slave states could easily block. This was a Southern opposition to secession, 1860 to 1861, showing vote by county. Hot passions, not cool reasons, began to drive events. South Carolina had threatened to secede if sectional Lincoln won, so 4 days after the election, South Carolina called a special convention, and meeting in Charleston in December of 1860, the convention voted unanimously to secede. The action set off a chain reaction of secession. The Crittenden amendments to the Constitution were sponsored by Senator John Crittenden from Kentucky to appease the South. The slavery in the territories north of the 3630 line would be banned, but south of the line it would be federally protected in all territories existing or hereafter to be required. Future states could come into the Union with or without slavery as they chose, and slavery supporters were guaranteed full rights in the southern territories regardless of popular sovereignty during the territorial period. Lincoln flatly rejects the Crittenden scheme. He was elected on the platform that opposed the extension of slavery into the territories, and Lincoln felt that he could not yield, even if slavery gains might only be temporary. As the Crittenden Compromise failed in early 1861, 6 more southern states voted to secede: Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. 4 more would join later, bringing the total to 11. They formed the Confederate States of America, formed by the 7 seceding states in Montgomery, Alabama, in February 1861, and they choose Jefferson Davis as their president. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, can be seen here in this picture. The crisis deepens by the lame duck interlude. Lincoln could not take office until March 4, 1861. During this time period, inaugurations were not held in January, they were held in March. During this time, the secessionist move gained momentum, and Buchanan is really blamed for not holding the Union together. He allowed the states to secede. He did not believe the southern states could legally secede, but he could find no authority in the Constitution for stopping them. Another reason was he did not resort to force. He had a tiny standing army of 15,000 that was needed to control the Indians in the West. And the North was also not interested in fighting at this time. And the weakness was not so much in Buchanan, but in the Constitution and the Union itself. Ironically, when Lincoln became president, he continues Buchanan's wait-and-see policy. Secessionists left for a number of reasons, mostly related to slavery. They threatened the North's despotic majority of numbers. They were dismayed by the triumph of the Republican Party. They were weary of free soil criticism, abolitionist nagging, and the Northern interference ranging from the Underground Railroad to John Brown's raid. They supported secession because they were sure that they would be able to depart and be unopposed. And they saw secession as a golden opportunity to cast aside generations of vassalage to the North. An independent Dixieland could develop its own banking and shipping and trade directly with Europe, which is what it wanted to do. Who could tell when greedy Republicans would pass another oppressive protective tariff? Tensions for decades between the North and the South, with its manufacturing plants in the North and the South with its agricultural exports, had been going on for some time. Worldwide impulses of nationalism were fermenting in the South, and the principles of self-determination from the Declaration of Independence seemed to many Southerners to apply. Few Southern states felt they were doing anything wrong or immoral. The historical parallel ran even deeper. In 1776, the 13 American colonies, led by rebel George Washington, had seceded from the British Empire. And in 1860 to 1861, 11 American states, now led by the rebel Jefferson Davis, were seceding from the Union by throwing off the yoke of King Abraham Lincoln. With the Union burden gone, the South was confident that it could work out its own peculiar destiny more quietly, happily, and prosperously. This is a picture of the eagle's nest, which shows the American eagle jealously guarding her nest of states and bidding defiance to the rebels. This is the chronology from the chapter.